Montana Territory. Late October, 1883. While his neighbors hammered together conventional log cabins along the valley floor, one man dug into a hillside with nothing but a pick and determination. They watched him disappear into the earth each morning. They shook their heads. Some laughed. Then the rain came early. Cold, relentless. Autumn rain that soaked every split cord of firewood stacked under open sheds and canvas tarps across the settlement. When the first hard freeze arrived in early November, families faced a terrifying reality. Their fuel wouldn't burn. Wetwood produces smoke, not heat. And winter in Montana doesn't negotiate. What that man understood, while digging his hole in the hill, would save him from the crisis that nearly broke his neighbors. By midwinter, the same people who mocked him would be standing at his door, asking one question: how is your wood still dry? Before we go further, hit that subscribe button. By the end of this story, you'll see the one number that made the entire settlement rethink everything they knew about winter survival. And I want to know, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop it in the comments. Jacob Reimer arrived in Montana Territory with $50, a steel pick, and 12 years of experience in German-Russian coal mines. He wasn't a carpenter. He wasn't a builder. He was a man who understood what Earth could do when you work with it instead of against it. His homestead claim sat on a south-facing slope. No flat ground, no timber stands, no ideal building site by conventional standards. While others secured valley plots with access to water and level foundations, Jacob got what nobody wanted: a steep hillside covered in sage and rock. By mid-October, he still had no cabin. His neighbors, nearly finished with their log structures, watched him dig, not a foundation, a tunnel, straight into the hill, angling slightly upward. The settlement's women refused to visit. That's not a home, they said. That's a grave. But Jacob had a problem his neighbors didn't yet recognize. Early snow arrived October 28th, melted by afternoon sun, then froze again at night. His firewood, stacked in the open like everyone else's, began absorbing water. He split a piece one morning and saw a moisture bead on the fresh surface. He knew what that meant. Wetwood doesn't burn. It smolders. It produces creosote. It fills a cabin with smoke and delivers half the heat. So he kept digging, not just living quarters. He extended his hillside excavation into a second chamber, a wood gallery, connected to his dwelling space by an internal door. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. You don't store firewood underground. Everyone knew that. Underground meant damp. Underground meant rot. Underground meant mold and decay. Jacob didn't argue. He simply kept working. He understood something they didn't. The earth, 14 feet deep, doesn't follow surface weather. It holds a steady temperature. And if you give it ventilation, give it air movement, give it a reason to pull moisture away instead of trap it, the hillside becomes a drying chamber, not a tomb. Here's what Jacob Reimer built while his neighbors watched and whispered. He dug 14 feet into the hillside at a slight upward angle, maybe 5 degrees. Not steep, but enough to let any water drain naturally toward the entrance instead of pooling inside. The main chamber measured 12 feet by 14 feet. Low ceiling, just 6.5 feet at the center. Timber supports every 4 feet. Roof logs covered with 18 inches of excavated earth. Then a layer of sod cut from the hillside above. But the unusual part, the part that made people call it foolish, was the second chamber, the wood gallery. 8 feet wide, 20 feet deep, carved parallel to the living space. He connected them with a doorway barely wide enough for a man carrying an armload of split wood. Inside the wood gallery, he stacked firewood on log rails, keeping it 6 inches off the earth floor. At the far end of the gallery, he drove a 6-inch diameter pipe 18 feet up through the hillside to the surface. A ventilation shaft, nothing elaborate, just a passage for air to move. In the living chamber, he built a small firebox from salvaged brick and river stone. Simple design, no fancy masonry. Just a firebox, a short chimney, and one small south-facing window, 10 inches by 14 inches, to let in light. People didn't understand what they were looking at. To them, it was a root cellar with delusions. "You'll suffocate in there," said the timber supplier. "That will rot by Christmas," said a freighter passing through. "You're wasting your time," said most everyone else. But Jacob knew the physics, even if he didn't have the vocabulary for it. When you light a fire in an enclosed space connected to a wood gallery with a ventilation shaft, you create a gentle draft. Warm air rises through the chimney. Cool air gets pulled in through the entrance. That moving air passes through the wood gallery on its way to the firebox. Not fast, just a constant, patient circulation, like breathing. And the earth? The hillside held steady at about 48 degrees Fahrenheit, even when surface temperatures dropped below zero. Not warm enough to feel comfortable, but warm enough to prevent freezing. Warm enough to keep moisture from condensing. Warm enough to let damp would slowly release its water content into air that was constantly being replaced, constantly being pulled toward the fire, constantly moving. The neighbor saw a desperate man digging a hole. Jacob saw a passive drying kiln powered by nothing but physics and patience. Olaf Strand had been building in cold climates for 30 years. Norwegian by birth, Montana by choice, he constructed over 40 cabins across the territory. When he visited Jacob's hillside in early November, he didn't hide his opinion. "I've seen men freeze to death in better shelters than that hole," Strand said, standing at the entrance. "You'll be begging for a real roof by Christmas." Others were less direct, but equally dismissive. The settlement's women considered the dugout improper, unsuitable for family, unsafe for children, barely acceptable for livestock. "It's not a cabin," one said. "It's where you store potatoes." The timber supplier who sold Jacob his door frame and window glass laughed when he delivered them. "You're wasting good materials on that pit. That what you got stacked in there? It'll be soup by January. Mark my words." Even families who, like Jacob personally, kept their distance. There was something uncomfortable about a man living underground. It suggested desperation. It suggested failure. It suggested he wasn't capable of building a proper home, that he wasn't, perhaps, man enough for a Montana winter. Jacob didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He simply thanked people for their concern and went back to work. He cut firewood. He stacked in his gallery on the log rails, spacing each piece so air could move between them. He carved small notches in the ventilation shaft's upper opening to prevent snow from blocking it. He built a second door at his entrance, creating an airlock of sorts, a buffer zone between outside cold and inside warmth. His neighbors saw stubbornness. Jacob saw preparation. And when the November rains came, cold, wind-driven, relentless, the difference between those two perspectives became measurable in degrees, in cord of wood, and in the simple ability to stay warm without burning everything you owned. November 12, 1883. A massive low-pressure system stalled over the northern Rockies and refused to move. For 11 days, freezing rain and wet snow hammered the settlement. Temperatures dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit at night, climbed only to the low 20s during the day. Wind drove moisture into every crack, every seam, every poorly sealed corner of every cabin in the valley. But the real crisis wasn't the cold. It was the firewood. Across the settlement, families discovered that their carefully stacked cords, stored under sheds, under canvas, under overhanging eaves, had absorbed water. The outer layers froze solid. The inner layers stayed damp. When you split a piece and put it in the firebox, it hissed, it smoked. It produced a fraction of the heat it should have delivered. Neighbors began burning wood continuously just to maintain 50 degrees inside their cabins. Children slept in day clothes under every blanket the family owned. Women cooked with fires that produced more smoke than flame. Men went out every 2 hours through the night to feed fireboxes that consumed twice the normal amount of fuel and delivered half the warmth. Some families resorted to burning furniture. Others cut green wood that hadn't seasoned at all, and tried to force it to burn with kindling and prayer. Chimneys clogged with creosote. Cabins filled with acrid smoke that stung eyes and throats. 3 families temporarily moved in with neighbors who had slightly better situations, crowding 8 or 10 people into spaces meant for 4. Jacob Reimer's dugout produced almost no visible smoke. Neighbors noticed. On the 5th day of the storm, Olaf Strand walked up the hillside path and stood outside Jacob's entrance, watching. Barely a wisp rising from the short chimney. No constant fire tending. No frantic wood splitting in the freezing rain. Strand didn't knock. He just stood there for 10 minutes, watching that nearly invisible smoke, then walked back down to his own cabin where the firebox demanded feeding every 90 minutes. Stay with me. Because what happened next wasn't just about survival. It was about one number that nobody could argue with. If you want to see frontier techniques that actually work when lives depended on it, hit subscribe right now. We're just getting to the part where physics proves everyone wrong. On November 23rd, the storm finally broke. Skies cleared. Temperatures dropped further, 4 below zero that night, but at least the rain stopped. The settlement took inventory. Olaf Strand walked back up to Jacob's dugout. This time he knocked. Jacob invited him in. Strand had to duck through the entrance, pass through the small airlock, then step down into the main chamber. The first thing he noticed, it was warm, not blazing hot, not uncomfortable, just warm. Steady, he guessed around 60 degrees, maybe a bit more. The second thing he noticed, the firebox held a modest fire, small pieces of wood burning clean, producing minimal smoke, radiating heat into the stone mass Jacob had built around it. Not a roaring inferno, just a patient, efficient burn. Your wood, Strand said. Show me. Jacob opened the interior door to the gallery. Strand stepped inside and ran his hand over a split piece of pine. Dry, completely dry. He picked it up, felt its weight. Light. He broke off a small splinter and examined it. No moisture, no dampness, no soft spots. How long has this been in here? Strand asked. 8 days, Jacob said. Brought it in wet. Stacked it the day before the rain started. Strand did the math in his head. 8 days underground had dried wood at his own shed, built with proper ventilation, proper roof coverage, proper construction. Couldn't keep dry through the same storm. He asked to see the ventilation system. Jacob showed him the shaft, explained the air movement, the gentle draft created by the fire, the earth's steady temperature preventing condensation. Strand didn't say much. He just nodded, touched the walls, felt the dry earth, observed the complete absence of mold or rot. Before he left, he asked one more question. How much were you burning per day? 1 fire in the morning, Jacob said, for maybe 5 hours. 1 in the evening. Same. Maybe 12, 15 pieces total. Good pieces. Dry pieces that burn clean. Strand was burning 30 to 40 pieces a day. Wet pieces that smoldered and choked and delivered half the heat. And his cabin was colder. The number that changed everything. 18%. That's the moisture content Jacobs would reach after 8 days in his hillside gallery. His neighbor's wood, stored in conventional sheds for 6 months before the storm, measured between 28 and 35% after the rain stopped. Dry wood means cleaner burn, more heat per piece, less smoke, less creosote, less work. 62 degrees inside with half the wood. That's what Jacob's system delivered. Not a miracle, not luck, just physics, just earth temperature, air movement, and patient understanding of how moisture behaves when you give it a path to leave. By late December, 3 families had started excavating their own hillside extensions. Not complete dugouts. Most kept their existing log cabins, but with galleries carved into slopes behind their homes. Ventilation shafts appeared on hillsides across the valley, small doors connecting living spaces to earth-coupled storage chambers. Olaf Strand was one of them. He publicly admitted his error at a settlement meeting in January. I was wrong about Reimer's method, he said. The hillside does the work. If you've got a slope and you've got wet winters, this system makes sense. The technique spread through word of mouth and direct observation. Families adapted it to their specific situations. Some dug smaller galleries, just 8 by 10 feet, enough for a month's supply of drying wood. Others went larger, creating multi-chamber systems that stored not just firewood but root vegetables, preserved foods, and tools that needed protection from moisture. By the winter of 1884 to 85, variations of Jacob's design appeared across the region. A homesteader near Helena built a hybrid structure, half cabin, half dugout, with a continuous wood gallery running the entire length of one wall. Another family near Bozeman excavated under their existing cabin floor, creating an earth-coupled drying chamber accessed through a trapdoor. Local merchants began noting the trend. A hardware supplier's ledger from 1886 includes an entry, Reimer's method, earth coupled with seasoning, gaining acceptance in slope-dwelling homesteads, proven effective for high-moisture climates. The mockery stopped. The technique became simply what you do if you're smart and you've got a hillside. No longer desperate, no longer foolish. Just practical adaptation recognized and validated by the only judge that mattered, survival through Montana winter. Within 2 years, an estimated 12 to 15 homesteads within 40 miles had incorporated hillside with storage with ventilation systems into their building plans. Some hired Jacob as a consultant. He charged nothing. He just showed them the angle of excavation, the spacing with stacks, the importance of updraft and air movement. The shelter they called useless became the template they copied, not because Jacob convinced them with arguments, but because physics convinced them with warmth. Jacob Reimer didn't invent underground living. Humans have been digging into hillsides for thousands of years, from Neolithic settlements to frontier dugouts across the Great Plains. What Jacob did was combine old-world mining knowledge with practical observation of how earth temperature, air movement, and moisture behave when you give them the right conditions. The mockery he faced wasn't about engineering. It was about culture. Real homes were supposed to look a certain way, stand a certain way, announce themselves above ground with walls and roofs and visible permanence. A hole in a hillside suggested failure, poverty, desperation. It suggested you couldn't build what everyone agreed a home should be. But survival doesn't care about aesthetics. It doesn't care about social expectations or conventional wisdom. It responds to thermal mass, airflow, moisture control, and the patient physics of how heat moves through space. Jacob's system worked because Earth 14 feet deep maintains a stable temperature, roughly 48 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of surface weather. That steady warmth prevents moisture from condensing, allows damp wood to release water vapor into moving air, and creates a passive dry environment powered by nothing but the gentle draft from a modest fire. Modern applications of the same principles surround us. Root cellars, earth-sheltered homes, geothermal heating and cooling, wine caves, seed storage vaults. Any system that leverages stable ground temperature to control moisture and maintain consistent conditions traces back to the same physics Jacob understood in 1883. The frontier didn't reward pride. It didn't reward stubbornness or blind adherence to how things were supposed to be done. It rewarded observation, adaptation, and willingness to let results speak louder than reputation. They laughed at the hole in the hill, until dry firewood became the difference between comfort and crisis, until 62 degrees with half the wood became impossible to argue with, until the man they dismissed as foolish became the one they asked for advice. Now I want to hear from you. What part of Jacob's system would you apply to your own setup today? Drop a comment with where you're watching from and the coldest winter you've ever faced. And if you want more real survival techniques that actually work when it mattered most, techniques that frontier families prove with their lives, subscribe and hit that bell, because next week, we're diving into why one Montana rancher's backwards chimney design saved his family when everyone else has failed. You won't believe what he understood about draft and heat retention that trained masons missed.